Guten Abend miteinander, willkommen im Kosmos. Mein Name ist Martin Roth, ich bin Geschäftsführer vom Kosmos und möchte Sie ganz herzlich begrüßen zum heutigen Abend. Wir haben ein spannendes und interessantes Thema. Ich freue mich sehr. Ich hoffe und möchte Sie auch bitten um eine angeregte wie auch konstruktive Diskussion heute Abend. Bevor es losgeht, aber noch eine kleine Intervention, ein Thema, das uns am Herzen liegt, das wir möchten schnell präsentieren. Es hat jetzt nichts mit dem heutigen Abend zu tun, aber 2 Minuten bitte Gehör verschaffen am Tobias Ganterbey. Merci.
Danke, Martin. Ich mache es auf Hochdeutsch. Ich hoffe, das ist okay. Ich weiß nicht, ob hier alle Mundart verstehen. Personen, die im Kanton, auf deren Asylgesuch die Schweiz nicht eintritt, die landen in der Nothilfe. Nothilfe, das ist ein von der Bundesverfassung gesichertes Recht für alle Menschen, die in Not geraten. So wie die Nothilfe im Kanton Zürich umgesetzt wird, zwingt sie die Asylsuchenden aber in ein unwürdiges Dasein. In den 5 Notunterkünften in den Kanton Zürich werden die Bewegungsfreiheit, die Privatsphäre, aber auch und besonders die Rechte von Kindern systematisch verletzt. In den Unterkünften herrschen Zustände von Perspektivlosigkeit, von Enge, von Kontrolle und von Isolation. Die Menschen verbringen dort Monate, teils sogar Jahre in diesen unmenschlichen Zuständen. Mit unserer Kampagne Unterkünfte ohne Not wollen wir die Öffentlichkeit auf diese Zustände aufmerksam machen und aufzeigen, dass eben auch in unserer Nachbarschaft solche Rechte verletzt werden. Und wir wollen mit unserer Kampagne uns dafür stark machen, dass die fundamentalen Ansprüche auf Bewegungsfreiheit, auf Privatsphäre und eben auch auf eine unbeschwerte Kindheit für alle Menschen gelten, unabhängig von ihrem Aufenthaltsstatus, einfach nur deshalb, weil sie Menschen sind. Wir wollen Unterkünfte ohne Not, sprich eine menschenwürdige Unterbringung der Betroffenen in den Gemeinden und nicht in solch miserablen Kollektivunterkünften. Wenn ihr unser Anliegen auch unterstützen wollt oder könnt, dann könnt ihr auf unsere Website gehen, www.unterkünfte-ohne-not.ch und dort unseren dringenden Aufruf unterschreiben. Und ihr könnt natürlich unsere Inhalte auf Social Media teilen und liken und damit uns dabei helfen, möglichst viele Menschen zu erreichen. Ich habe auch ein paar Flyer mitgebracht, die liegen da auf und ich bin nach dem Event auch noch hier für Fragen, wenn irgendjemand etwas wissen möchte. Vielen Dank dafür. Samir?
Danke. Guten Abend, mein Name ist Samir. Ich gehöre hier zu den Kosmonauten. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie so zahlreich gekommen sind, auch in diesem Wetter. Und vor allem freue ich mich noch mehr, dass wir Ilan Pappé bei uns haben können. Ilan, wenn du vielleicht magst. Ilan versteht ein bisschen Hochdeutsch. Ja. Von zu Hause. Das ist vielleicht auch ein guter Grund, um vielleicht dich noch ein bisschen unter den Leuten bekannt zu machen, die nicht wissen, wer du bist und für was dass du stehst. Vielleicht wechseln wir dann später auf Englisch. Weil das ist.
I understood this.
Yeah,
this
until
I
yet.
understood.
Okay. So you were born in Haifa, is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, and you're a little bit elderly than I am, but we are almost the same age. So
We're all young.
we're all young. So tell me more about. I noticed that you spoke already Arabic outside with some people. So you're one of the rare Israelis I know which really speaks fluent Arabic, and German, of course. German, yes. Because your parents were
German Jews.
Yes. So can you tell us a little bit more about the story
definitely,
of
Definitely. I was happy to talk. I was born in Haifa in 1954. Both my parents came from Germany. Most of my parents came from Germany. They met in Palestine. My father came in 1934. My mother came in 1933. And they lived, when I was born, like so many German Jews, they lived on Mount Carmel in Haifa.
Yeah.
And Mount Carmel was a bit of a German Jewish ghetto. I remember the signs were in German when I was 10 or 11. And my parents didn't speak Hebrew that well. And I was always condemned in school because the teacher used to ask me, "Did you answer your parents in German?" And I said yes, because I wanted something from them. And he said, "That's very bad. You should speak Hebrew to them." So this is where I grew. Haifa, Mount Carmel was a gated community also with regard to the rest of Haifa. So it took time to meet Palestinians.
I see.
This would happen a bit later. And I had a very typical Israeli Jewish upbringing.
You went also
which
to
included the military service. I was in the on the Golan Heights in the 1973 war.
Okay.
But then things began to be a bit different. And life became, as the Chinese curse has it, more interesting. When I slowly began to be interested in history as a professional academic, but also as an activist. And the more I was interested in my own country's history, the more I found myself clashing with the ideology behind the Jewish state and its policies, and also its academia. And the rest is history, as I say.
So, what kind of activist were you at that
Well,
time?
I began actually when I left the army. I was working in the Israeli parliament, in the Israeli Knesset, with a left Zionist party called Mapam.
Mapam, okay.
And I was their advisor on Palestinian or Arab affairs. I don't remember exactly how we called it. And as long as I was in Israel, I was still within, if you want, the Zionist way of thinking, although very much on the left. But in 1979, oh my God, that's a long time ago. This is before this century, the previous century. In 1979, I decided that I want to do a PhD. And I decided to, I didn't decide actually, it was recommended to me that it's a very good idea to do a doctorate outside if you want a good academic career inside. So I went to the University of Oxford in England, and I made the conscious decision that I want to work with an Arab supervisor, because I wanted to see things from a different perspective. And I was very lucky and fortunate to be the last student of one of the greatest historians of the Middle East, Albert Khorani. Was really a unique person. And I remember that we discussed what should I do for my doctorate. And I told him I'm very interested in 1948 because the Palestinians see it as a catastrophe, almost as a Holocaust, and the Israelis see it as the best year in the history of the Jewish people. So I thought I would like to work with it. And I remember he saying to me, take a few days to think about it because it will change your life. And I said, what does he know? What is he talking about? It's a PhD. But he knew. He said, if you are going to work on it, your life will be very different. Or as my youngest son said to me, why at this point did you not decide to work on the history of Finland in the 16th century so that our life would have been much easier? I said to him, you're right, but it's too late. And I should say, and of course I'll talk about it maybe a bit later in my talk, that I was lucky. I was in the year, when I did my PhD, the most important documents about 1948 were released by the British archives. They have a rule that they release documents every 30 years. And also the Israelis had a similar rule of releasing documents every 30 years. So suddenly there was a new evidence of what happened in the year that I was interested in. So I could write quite easily a book or a dissertation that was new, that dealt with something that someone else has not yet seen.
Okay. So, and then you went back with this PhD.
Yes, I went back to Israel, and I was surprised to hear that people did not particularly like to hear about 48 in the way that I told it. But I also found out that I was not alone. There were another 2 or 3 historians who saw the same material and came to similar conclusions. And one of them, one of them had a good, because he was a journalist, Benny Morris, had a good kind of journalistic instinct. So he coined a phrase, and he said, "We are the new historians."
He made the label.
He made the label.
I see.
Many years later, I told him he should have called us the young historians. It's much nicer at the age of 64 to be called the young historian, because at the age of 64 you cannot be a new historian anymore. But young is nice. But anyway, he called us the young historians, and the new historians. I'm sorry, I wish he did. And it was an interesting time because the media was interested in what we have found. And
that was late 80s.
The late 80s, and it was helped. I think the main period is when the Oslo Accord began, because there was more of an readiness to hear a little bit about the Palestinian side of the story, and the new historians were more legitimate. And then after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and the Oslo Accord came to an end, it was not so good to be a new historian. And the clever ones understood it and became old historians again. But the stupid ones, like me, became even more radical in their position, and life became even more interesting for them. So, yeah, that's the story.
Okay, so a lot of people ask me, but he is not anymore in Israel, and he is not living there, and he don't know anything about Israel anymore. And so, is that so?
Must be very nice people, and I meet them all over the place. I was under a very strong attack by my own university in the beginning of this century. And under threats.
Which university was
the University of Haifa.
So you went back to Haifa?
I went back to Haifa, and I taught there for 20 years, and everything was relatively fine. But then the second uprising, the second intifada broke out, and Israelis became, again, quite anti-Palestinian and more suspicious of critical views. And it was very difficult in my university to teach and research the way I wanted, and I clashed with my university and with the society at large, and eventually I had to leave in 2006 to England.
I see.
And I left because it was also the university pressured me to leave. They didn't want me to stay, and the rest of the academia didn't like what I was doing, and. But I continued to work on 48. These are the years when I wrote my book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It took me about 6 to 7 years to write it. And it became, at least for Palestinians, a very important book, but also to the rest of the world. I'm sorry, but I haven't answered your question, actually. See, I started talking. You asked me whether do I know about Israel after I left. Well, we just have to say when I left. I come back all the times, and my family is still there, so at least I do know what's going on, and I'm an Israeli citizen, and I don't want to lose my Israeli citizenship. I believe in fighting on the ground for changing. I work in England because nobody was willing to employ me in Israel, not because I wanted to leave.
I see.
So I go back and forth. I'm involved as much as I can. And yes, I think that as long as you can stay in a place and fight for what you believe in, you should do it. Of course, sometimes you cannot. Sometimes you are exiled by force. But
so you are not self-hating. That's not the reason why you left.
Maybe I am. I don't know. You know, I was 2 weeks ago in America, in Cleveland, and someone asked me, "Are you a self-hating Jew?" And I said to them, you know, I knew that in the crowd, most of the Palestinians who came to hear me are doctors, physicians. They work in hospitals. So I said, you know, I have a lot of Palestinian friends who are doctors. So I went to them to ask if I'm self-hating. And they said yes, and there is no cure. So what can you do? It's a disease, apparently.
Okay.
Yes.
So something else is always, you know, when I told everyone that we will bring you here to Zurich, they said, yeah, but you know, Ilan he's taking party. You know, he's not objective. He's not. But I was surprised when I wrote your book that you were able really to go deeply into the facts, all the stories about the Haganah and what had happened when the ethnic cleansing started, and so I'm wondering, what is your position on that?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that you can be an objective historian when you write about your own history. It's inhuman to think that you write your own history and you say you are objective. What you can be is a professional, but it's not the same thing. People confuse between being a professional and being an objective. When you are professional, it means you are looking for the facts, you are looking for the documents, you are looking for the evidence, but you don't deny that you have a moral position. And it's very interesting when people write about the Holocaust, they are never expected to be objective. They're expected to be very subjective, and they know exactly why anyone who denies the Holocaust is almost a criminal in their eyes, and rightly so, in my mind. But I think it's as bad to deny the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. And you know, in Israel today, we have the Nakba law. It's an incredible law. It's a law that says, well, originally the law said, actually, that if you mention the events of 1948 as a catastrophe, you can be in prison for 3 years.
Really?
But they changed that version. It's a much softer version. Okay. And now it says that if you are getting any money from the government as a community center, as a school, as a university, any body or individual that is entitled to get from the government any kind of financial assistance and dares to mention the events of 1948 as a tragedy, as a Nakba, will not get the funds anymore. Let's call the Nakba law. The next stage would be, of course, to put you in prison for just mentioning it. My son calculated, he said to me, you are violating all these laws, you should already be in life prison. But so far it didn't happen, yes.
Okay. So what are you going to tell us in your lecture tonight?
What I would like to talk in the lecture is, first of all, I know some of you, because I know some of you, know what the new history in Israel has found out. But I would like just to repeat this very shortly. I think it's always important to know what the new Israeli historians have found. I want to say what happened after they found what they found, what happens in the research, in the academic research on 1948, both in Israel and outside of Israel. And to finish by thinking together about why is it so important still to struggle over the story of 48. Why do I feel that 48 is the key for understanding why there is a conflict, and it's a key, in my mind, for a solution. And all the people and the states and the organizations that were involved in the peace process totally ignored 1948. And I think that's one of the reasons that all these efforts, whether they were genuine or not genuine, this is why all these efforts have failed, because they tended to ignore the importance of 48. So I think it's a very important year that you should study, analyze, and understand that it holds the key for the future solution in Israel and Palestine.
So after that, we will open the discussion for the public. Is that okay?
Always happy to talk to the public.
This is now 70 years ago. I hope it will be not 70 minutes. Maybe
no.
You
give me. We'll divide it by 2. We'll make it 35.
Okay.
1 minute for good. 2 years.
And then we can also discuss maybe topics like, why you're using ethnic cleansing as a word, all that stuff which you, as I understood, you were always attacked by because you are using these words. And
yeah,
so,
definitely.
Okay,
definitely.
Good. So let's have the...
I can't see you. Maybe it's good. I don't know. As long as you can see me, that's okay. Okay, I'll see your hand for the 5 minutes. Yes, that's for sure. Okay. As I mentioned before, a group of Israeli historians who were professional historians in the late 1980s used new archival material that became open and accessible, both in Israel, in the United Kingdom, to a certain extent in America and France, and definitely also in the United Nations. And they were exposed to a lot of new documents about 1948. Those historians, until that moment, were brought up, like most Israeli Jews, on a certain, what we call a narrative, a certain historical version, that you can still find in some Israeli textbooks today in high schools, and quite a few Israeli politicians would mention this narrative, this Israeli mainstream narrative. And that narrative said, in 1947, Britain decided to leave Palestine, referred the question of Palestine to the United Nations. The United Nations had a peace proposal to divide Palestine into 2 states, but the Palestinians and the Arabs rejected the partition plan and told the Arab population to leave, and that's how the Palestinians became refugees. And then the Arab state tried to destroy the state of Israel, but out of miracle, the small state succeeded in defeating 7 Arab armies. Now, what the new historians, and I won't mention all the things that they have found, but there were 3 major issues that interested them. One was the balance of power in the chronology, and I'll explain what I mean. It seemed that there is a bit of a problem with the story the way I told it now. Not with the fact that the United Nations suggested partition, that is true, and nobody denies that the Palestinians and the Arab world rejected the idea of partitioning Palestine. But the story that the Arab world went to war, and as a result of this, the Palestinians became refugees, has a problem, a chronological problem. Because after the partition plan, which was in the end of November 1947, already the Jewish forces, we cannot yet call them Israeli forces because only in the 15th of May Israel became officially a state. So the Jewish forces began already expelling Palestinians from almost all the Palestinian towns and cities. In fact, half of the Palestinians that became refugees were already refugees when the State of Israel was declared on the 15th of May, and when the Arab world, under the pressure of these refugees, decided to interfere in Israel, in mandatory Palestine, and try to prevent the further, what I would call, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. We also looked at the balance of power, and we were not convinced that the way we were taught in school, that there was a small Israeli David fighting a huge Arab Goliath, had anything to do with the real balance of power. We counted how many people fought against how many people, and the military balance most of the time were to the Jewish advantage. Now, this is important not so much for peace and reconciliation. It's important because the Israelis were brought up on this idea that it was a miracle. It was not a miracle. There was a logical explanation why the war ended the way it ended from a military point of view. But possibly the most important topic out of the three, and I will mention the third one in a moment, was the second one. And this was the question of why did the Palestinians become refugees? Is it true that the Arab leaders and the Palestinian leaders told them to leave so that they could make way for the Arab armies to occupy Palestine? We did something that actually before us an Irish journalist already did in the early 1960s. The British, the BBC, we all know what the BBC is, was monitoring, was listening to everything that was in the air since 1936 in the Arab world, from 1936 onward. And they have a very big archive in the town of Reading, which is not far away from London. And we, like that Irish journalist, Erskine Childers, we went to the archives in Reading to see whether anyone was calling on the Palestinians to leave, as the Israeli propaganda would have it. And we didn't find one call by any Arab leader to the Palestinians to leave. What we did find is quite a clear plans and commands, which at the time looked reasonable from the Israeli point of view, to try and push out the Palestinians from Palestine. And if you look at the history of Zionist thought, even before 48, if you read the letters of Ben-Gurion to his son in 1937, if you look at the way the early Zionists talked about the Palestinians, you know that Zionism was not that different from other movements of Europeans that went to places such as North America, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, where the native population looked as an obstacle, as a problem, for creating a new life for people who really had to leave Europe. Otherwise, as we know, they would have been genocided. So we understand that they had to leave. And we even understand in the case of the Zionist movement why they chose Palestine and not anywhere else. But unfortunately, like the movement of white people who moved to North America, the main problem in their eyes was the presence of the indigenous native population. So the fact that in 48, the leaders of the Zionist movement and later the young state of Israel saw the end of the British mandate as an opportunity to try and take as much of Palestine as possible and leave in it as few Palestinians as possible is not surprising. They are not the only ones who did it, and I think that this is something that we will have to come back to if we want to talk about a solution in the future. So that was something else that we found in the archives, a much clearer idea of Israeli, before Zionist leaders and later on Israeli leaders, determination to use the historical circumstances of the end of the mandate, the fact that the Palestinians did not accept the United Nations petition resolution, the fact that the Arab world will send troops, to use it in order to clean Palestine from as many Palestinians as possible. And unfortunately, as you know, when you do this, you are not gently asking people to leave. Sometimes it is accompanied by massacres. We found about 33 massacres that people did not write about before us. And massacres were meant not to genocide people, but to make sure that they live. And for us, I can speak here only for myself at this moment, it was shocking because of the way I was brought up. I was brought up on the idea that Israel has the most moral army in the world, that our arms are pure, the purity of arms. In Hebrew, it's called, I forgot the name, Musar, Neshek Musari, or something like that. Tohar HaNeshek, thank you. Tohar HaNeshek, thank you. Tohar HaNeshek, the purity of arms, Tohar HaNeshek. And I mean, there were always rumors. I read a novel by Samech Izhar called Khir Bet Chiza, and there were always rumors by people who participated that things were not as we thought they were, but the documents were far more extensive in what they gave us. The third thing we wrote about was about peace. After the war ended, the 48 war ended, we were brought up on the idea that Israel always extends its hand for peace, and there's no one there to take the hand. And actually what the documents show, that there was quite a willingness in the Arab world, and even among the Palestinians after 48, to come to some sort of a political arrangement and diplomatic solution, but Israel was in no mood to lose any of the achievements that it gained in the 48 war. My colleague Avi Shleim, don't know if you know the name, wrote a very good book on it. He was one of the new historians, called The Iron Wall. So any one of you who are interested in documentation of how all these peace initiatives were rejected by Israel should really look at this book. It's a very, very good book. So here we have a group of Israeli historians in many ways justify a lot of what the Palestinian historians were saying for many years. And it's not surprising that when we first appeared among Palestinians, especially Palestinian historians, they were a bit irritated with us. They said, we needed you to kosherize, to make it kosher, what we were saying for years. But was when we said this, people said, oh, you are lying, it's propaganda. When you say it, suddenly your books are published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, the New York Times, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, when it was a real newspaper, not like it's today. They were able to see that whether they like it or not, you needed Israeli historians to make their story valid. But later on, I think they saw the advantage of cooperating with us in rewriting the history on the basis of what we knew. And it's interesting. I would say that until the first Intifada, until 2000, we had some influence in Israel. Some people, even in the Ministry of Education, changed some of the textbooks for children and high school children to insert at least some of the ideas. There was an Israeli TV documentary series done for the Israeli, when they celebrated 50 years, the Jubilee, called Tekuma, Renaissance. And Tekuma included quite a few things that we were writing about, not just about 48, but also about how the Jews from Arab countries were treated in Israel, and how the Palestinian minority that was left in Israel was treated after 48. So there was a kind of openness. Actually, if you went to an Israeli university in 1996, even still, you look at the board and will see what people teach and what kind of conferences are taking place. There was a lot of criticism, self-criticism, that the academics were willing to be involved, and it influenced filmmakers, poets, writers, journalists, and even some politicians. But it's very interesting. It's a very interesting human phenomenon. When the second uprising occurred, all this critical energy disappeared. Now, I don't agree with the explanation which says because of the Second Intifada, all the critical voices in Israel stopped being heard. No, I think the Second Intifada was a good excuse for people not to continue the criticism, because I can tell you it's a very unpleasant journey when you question the basic things that your society believes in, the basic things that your society thinks are sacred. It's not a pleasant position to be in. And when you have an opportunity to say, wait a minute, I don't want to be there, an event like the second uprising, the Intifada, gives you a good excuse to do a mea culpa, to say I was wrong, I didn't get the right documents, I didn't understand enough. And many of my colleagues, unfortunately, did this U-turn. I actually went in another way. I felt that we missed something as new historians. And I think what we missed in new historians, especially when we talked about what is the Israeli responsibility for the making of the Palestinian refugee problem, and what is the connection between the Palestinian refugee problem and the lack of any genuine progress in peace between Israel and Palestine. I think we missed it because we were focused, me included, on the question who was responsible for the expulsion. Were people expelled by force? Did they run away because they were afraid? Did they leave because they believed it was better to leave? I mean, we had all these long debates of whether it was systematic or whether maybe it was a bit more mixed. And I think what we missed is the fact that the biggest crime of Israel was not allowing the people to come back. And then suddenly, when I started looking at it, I saw that it's not only me who thought that way. In fact, the rest of the world was thinking like this. And it's very interesting. I'll give you two examples. In 1949, the American administration of President Eisenhower sends a delegation to Israel, and the delegation comes back to the president and says, there is no reason in the world why hundreds of thousands of Palestinians should not be allowed to go back to their homes. Because, it's not because they were particularly good human beings. American delegates usually are not particularly good human beings. But it was not because of that. They said, it's the Cold War with Russia. A refugee problem is not good for us. It's not good for the Arab world. It would create problems in the Arab world. You have to remember, this was the biggest refugee problem in the Middle East. You're thinking today, you said, don't forget, of course, the new refugee problem is far worse. But at the time, this was the worst refugee problem. So the Americans said, okay, they talked to the Israelis and said, can you please allow all these refugees to come back? It's 49. And Israel's Ben-Gurion said, the Israeli prime minister said, no, we cannot allow them. They are responsible for what happened to them. And if they will come back, they will be traitors, fifth column. And you read the American documents, and you see the Americans saying, I'm sorry, this doesn't sound a reasonable answer. And I don't know if you know it, but the United States imposed sanctions on Israel for not allowing the return of the refugees. But the sanctions stopped the moment the Cold War intensified in Korea and not far away from here in Germany, in Berlin. Another example is a very interesting example. President Kennedy in 1961 became interested in the Palestine question for some reason again. And he was about to change American policy in the United Nations, and he wanted an American initiative for the return of the Palestinian refugees. And he wanted to move ahead with a clear resolution. There already was a United Nations resolution that demanded that Israel would allow the return of the refugees, Resolution 194 from the 11th of December 1948. But he wanted something even more committed, even sort of moving it to the Security Council, knowing that the Russians at the time would not oppose such an idea. And Ben-Gurion was very annoyed by this American move of Kennedy. There's an interesting thing in the documents, which I found much later, that he said to Israeli historians, we need you to write a history that would explain to the Americans that these people cannot come back and they are responsible, that they ran away. And the Israeli universities went along with Ben-Gurion. Everybody went along with Ben-Gurion. There's a new book, by the way, by Tom Segev called A State at Any Price. You should read it. Ben-Gurion comes out there as a very vindicative, cruel little leader. But we'll put that aside. So universities were frightened. I mean, Ben-Gurion says, I want a history. They produce a history, and they found an Iraqi Jew by the name of Ronnie Gabay, who didn't understand what was asked of him. He was given all the documents, and instead of producing the version that Ben-Gurion wanted, to say that the Palestinians are responsible, that they left because someone told them to leave, he wrote a report to Ben-Gurion saying, well, according to the documents, most of the Palestinians were expelled by Israeli forces. He's now in Australia, not surprisingly. And then they found another scholar, Moshe Maoz, who was another Iraqi Jew, but he understood a bit better. No, he understood a bit better what was demanded of him, and he wrote the kind of version that Israel wanted. I bring these two examples just to show you that, for me, these documents show that the main problem with Israel was, I mean, it's bad enough to expel, as I try to show in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing, but not allowing to return is the heart of the problem. And this explains for us why, for instance, the issue of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency of the United Nations, is so important to the story. Everybody thinks that the problem with UNRWA is that if the Americans will not fund it, nobody else would fund it, and then the refugees of Palestine would have no option but to be integrated in the Arab world. But that's because we fail to tell the history of UNRWA. We fail to tell the history of the United Nations relationship with the Palestinians. And we have to go back there for a minute to see, and this is what I'm working on now, and I think this is something that Palestinian historians are working on. And this is where 48 becomes relevant again to what we are doing and what this peace is all about between Israel and the Palestinians. The United Nations, as you know, suggested creating two states in Palestine, one Arab state and one Jewish state. The Arab League and the Palestinian leadership rejected the idea. The United Nations at that moment actually should have said to itself, if one side does not accept a peace plan, you go back to the desk and you prepare another peace plan. You don't say, they had a chance. If they don't accept it, that's the only plan in town. Especially when the side that did not accept the plan are 66% of the population. They are the native population. They are the indigenous population. And the people who accepted the plan, most of them came about 3 years earlier from Europe. So, you know, from the logic of the United Nations, it was a pity maybe that the Palestinians rejected the idea, but it was not the right move to say, this is it. You had a chance. There's a peace plan. You don't accept it, you will be punished for it. The United Nations people felt very bad about it when they learned that one of the main results of their own policy was the making of the Palestinian refugee problem. 750,000 Palestinian refugees in tents, in camps, very much the sites we've seen today after Syria and Iraq and so on. Really have terrible conditions. And then the United Nations says, okay, we have to change a bit our commitment. On the one hand, we have to take care of these refugees. I mean, we need to give them relief. We need to assist them. On the other hand, we have failed as the United Nations to respect the right of self-determination for the Palestinians. We were very good in respecting the right of self-determination of the Jews, but not of the Palestinians. And at the same time that they created UNRWA, they also created organizations that say that the world The United Nations represents the world. That the world is committed for the return of the refugees, not as a humanitarian act, as part of the United Nations commitment for the Palestinians' right for self-determination. Nobody in the United Nations thought that if you left your house, even if you did it because you were afraid and nobody expelled you, nobody said that because of you, you have no right to come back to your home. If you look at all the international conventions on refugee, especially the Geneva Convention of 1951, the first thing that the convention says, a refugee has the right to go back home unless it's dangerous for them. It's a sacred right. The international law doesn't have any sacred rights for refugees as much as the right to come back. And Israel always prevented the Palestinians for having that right. And this is something that without dealing with it, there will never be peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, because it's the heart of the problem. It's the heart of the issue. You can divide the land, you can find resources and divide them, you can divide space, you can divide water, but you cannot overlook a basic injustice, especially if the international community at the time said this is injustice, still says it's injustice, but doesn't have the political power to impose a reality that corrects this injustice. This is a very important point. To my mind, it's even more important than the question whether the solution is a one-state or a two-state solution, what will be the possible relationship between Palestinians and Jews, should there be a genuine reconciliation. I think it begins with the fact that the dispossession of the Palestinians, the massive expulsion or the massive flight, call it what you want, of the Palestinians, is something that had to be treated very differently, and not as if it is justified for a Jewish state to say, we don't want these Palestinians back because then we will not be a Jewish state, because we won't be a majority. This is inhuman. This is unaccepted ethically and morally. You cannot have such a position on the one hand. On the other hand, I fully understand the political, economic difficulties of implementing it. But morally, you cannot deny that this should be the basis for how to make a group of Jews who came in the late 19th century, already now a third generation of these Jewish settlers who came in the late 19th century, how to reconcile the relationship between the third generation, if you want, of settlers, most of them settlers, some of them, of course, were Jews who lived there for many years, but most of them were settlers, and the indigenous native population of Palestine. And how to reconcile is not just a matter because they are fighting each other, but because between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, we have an equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians, and the Jews have all the privileges and all the rights, and the Palestinians have hardly any rights. And this injustice is on the top of the other injustice I was talking about. Now, I know very cynical people around the world say to me, why are you talking about justice? Justice is not an important concept. Important concept is what the Americans invented all this in political science, how to manage a conflict. How to manage a conflict. Well, and I would say, yes, I've seen the places where Americans manage the conflict. I'm not very impressed. And I've seen places where people said justice is not an important part of the solution, and I've seen what happened. I think no. I think that the moral dimension of this story is very important, because I told them as an Israeli Jew, I am a product of the Israeli educational system. Admittedly, I don't think I'm a good product. I don't think they're very happy with the end result of the production line, but I am a product of that education system, and I know exactly how the Israeli Jews perceive the Palestinians, see the Palestinians, and it goes back to the early Zionists. They don't see the Palestinians as native, as indigenous. They see them as aliens. I remember one of the early work I did as an historian was on the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration. This is a very important group of Zionists who came between 1905 and 1914. And in many ways, the Israeli political, cultural leadership emerged from this group of people who came between 1905 to 1914. It's the, kind of the Mayflower of Israel, the second Aliyah. Now, these people wrote a lot. They wrote diaries and letters. They are a great treasure for the historian. They didn't miss anything. They wrote any mosquito bite, anything. Everything was written. And you can have a sense of how do they regard the fact that they came to a place that was not empty. For me, it was very interesting. I know that they were told back in Poland or Romania or Russia that the land is empty. But when they came, surely they saw that the land was not empty. Now, they used to come with a ship to Alexandria in Egypt, and then they would take a ferry from Alexandria to Jaffa, and then they would be taken by small boats from the ferry in Jaffa to the homes of Palestinians, first of all, because there was no Jewish homes there. And many of them spent the night either by paying probably by paying some money for Palestinians' landlords, and they spent the night in a Palestinian home. And they write the first letter back home under probably an oil lamp. There was no electricity. And they write, I'm sitting in the home of one of the aliens, Hazarim, the strangers, who have given me a room. And these are the people who actually took over our homeland that was ours 2,000 years ago. And this kind of sense that the Palestinians are strangers, are aliens, are like immigrants. And the immigrants are talking about them, that they are immigrants, is entrenched in Israeli DNA. And therefore, even if you are a liberal Israeli, you say, okay, I tolerate them. They can stay. They can have a state. Maybe they can have autonomy. But you don't see them as the indigenous native people of Palestine. And as long as the Israelis would do that, with all the power that they have, there will never be peace and reconciliation, and eventually both the Palestinians and the world, I think, would continue to reject this kind of approach. But it's a very important part of education which is not that easy to get rid of. I know it's not easy to get rid of, but I think it's very important to engage with the Israelis about it. I mean, I have another 5 minutes, so I'll summarize it in a way. From the moment you tell the story, you know, I lived here 2,000 years ago, and therefore this is my land, to the moment you have the Israeli nationality law that says that only the Jews have the right of self-determination in what is the state of Israel and would be the state of Israel, namely they are expanding the groups of Israel. When you take these two, the myth of the 2,000 years ago and the nationality law, you understand that there is a total denial of the indigeneity, of the fact that the Palestinians are the natives. And unless you do that, you cannot start a constructive dialogue. Now, the dialogue would be difficult. I have no idea how to solve it. I'm not a genius. It would be very difficult. It would be very difficult. But we wasted 70 years talking about things that have nothing to do with the conflict. And I'm sure that if we invest another 70 years, we will find a way. But for that, we have to humanize the Palestinians, struggle against the dehumanization of the Palestinians. We have to understand that a situation by which one community has privileges and the others doesn't creates a de facto apartheid state. And if you want peace, you cannot say, I'll have peace and then I'll stop the apartheid. I'll have peace and then I'll stop the occupation. I'll have peace and then I'll stop the discrimination. No, it's the other way around. You stop the discrimination, you stop the apartheid laws, you stop the colonization, and then you have a chance of fruitful negotiations between the settlers who are now third generation of Jews, who are that this is their home, undoubtedly, and the Palestinians, which this is their home as well. But at least this gives you a beginning of a genuine dialogue. I don't know whether Israelis could be convinced to do it without strong pressure from the outside. I support the BDS because of this. I have to say it bluntly and openly, because I feel that it will take a long time to change Israel from within, and it doesn't look too good in the near future, although I'm working very hard. I will just tell you that with this I would end. In 2000 actually, I moved from one place in Haifa to another little town near Haifa. And the local paper said, beware, this awful man has moved to your place. Close your door, don't let your daughters outside, or something like that. And my wife said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'll write to them a letter telling them that they're wrong. She said, that won't do. Let's put a small sign in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, inviting people to come to our home and listen to you. Let them listen to you and decide for themselves instead of... So, lo and behold, 50 people showed in our living room, and they stayed there, not consecutively, thank God, but they stayed there for 2 years. Every week they came. And I think I really influenced these kind of 50 people. And my youngest son, who's very good in mathematics, said to me, I don't know why you're such pessimistic, Daddy. It took you 2 years to convince 50 Israelis. All you need is 550 years, and people would think like you. Thank you very much.
So, probably there are a lot of questions.
Yes, I'm ready to take them on.
There.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there is already an enemy from Iran. Once I'm joking.
No, we should.
Okay.
We'll forgive it.
Yeah.
We'll forgive it.
Okay.
Do you need the mic? They'll bring one. They'll bring one.
Yeah, you finished from Oxford. I wrote a book for Oxford, so we are colleagues in some ways. I'm a mathematician, by the way. Do I understand you correctly that there is no solution at the actual state, or, to your opinion, isn't that better to think about one-state solution? Because if I just follow you, one vote, one person, mix them all, this, because nowadays they think there is a solution from the son-in-law of Mr. Trump. It will come one day, as in the last 70 years. But could you a little bit elaborate on one state or two states? That's important, I think.
It is important, I agree, and I didn't talk about it fully because it's my view. I wanted to analyze the situation. My personal view is very much like you state. I think the only solution is one person, one vote between the river and the Mediterranean all over Palestine. I also realize that this is not only a solution that most Israelis do not accept. This is also a solution that the Palestinian leaders, whether they are in the West Bank or Hamas, or the Israeli-Palestinian members of the Knesset do not accept. So I feel only modest in the sense that I believe in a solution that a lot of other people do not believe in. That never made me feel that my solution is wrong. And in fact, we created in Israel a small movement. It's called the One State Democratic Initiative, as you know, and we are trying to work for it. So yes, I really believe that this is the only solution. However, I take into account that the political elites on both sides are very far from accepting it. But that doesn't mean that it's not the right solution. Will it happen in my lifetime? I don't know, but I'm sure it will happen. I think the reality on the ground is such that creating segregation, creating gated community is not working. It's not working. And both the Jewish society and the Palestinian society are very young societies. But the young people are not represented in politics, not in Palestine and not in Israel. And it will be very interesting. Both societies have a lot of people under 20. And I think the young people, if I can judge from the internet and the cyberspace, they have some different perceptions from us about politics. And I'm really hopeful that I'm right in my optimism that for them human rights and civil rights would be the main reason that they get involved in politics. And this will be important not just for Israel and Palestine, it will be important for the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole. Thank you.
There is...
Looking at the development of the Israeli society, I doubt whether any solution could be found without a vast implosion of the Israeli social system. Can you convince me that I'm wrong?
Yeah. You know, I always say, as a historian, I predict about history. I don't want to predict about the future. It's difficult. Let me say this. I think you are right in one sense that the present, let me rephrase it. I think presently, not present, presently, there is no incentive among the Israeli Jewish society to vote differently from the way they vote, to change their basic beliefs. No society likes to give up privileges. We know it from South Africa. People don't like to give up privileges. It's not a normal thing. So you can say, well, one reason people would give privileges if, for instance, there is a terrible economic crisis. That's one possibility. Another is if Israel would be treated like South Africa, when you have not only boycott campaigns, when you have sanction campaign. Or, God forbid, defeat, in war. That also can happen. I don't like to play with these games. I mean, how many people have to die so that a society changes its mind? But it's true that also happens in Israel. No, I'm not sure I will be able to convince you because when I talk to you like this, I don't put my academic hat. I put my Israeli activist head. And as Israeli activist, I have to believe in what I said to my friend here, that this is the way forward, and it's a possible way forward, that I have to believe that the pressure that we are putting on Israel through the BDS campaign will be effective eventually, and that it is possible to do it without a terrible tragedy. To tell you now, if I put my professional hat as a historian, I don't know of many cases like this, the one I hope for. I'm very honest with you. The cases I know where oppression ended were ended by violence, unfortunately. But, it's the Holy Land. I don't know, maybe we will write a different chapter in history. I can tell you one thing. The way it is going, it cannot go forever. It's not the only place where injustice is very much part of the reality. Your country as well has injustice in it. And a lot of countries in the Arab world have injustice in them. Teaching history and studying history, you know that they never last forever. They never. The problem is that you are one human being, and maybe that not forever is not good enough for you because it will happen in your children's time and you will not be benefited. But as an activist, not as an academic, you work for it every day, as if it's possible. Otherwise, you will sit at home and do nothing. Yeah.
Next. Yes, can I ask you two things?
Yes.
So one historical question.
No,
So 1948, there were 750,000 refugees somewhere in Jordan, Lebanon. Now, if you look 1948, if you look at Europe, there were millions of displaced people living in Europe, right? Many from Eastern Europe, many Germans, right? It was out of question that any of them would return to their old homes, simply because there was the Iron Curtain, right?
Right.
Now, 1953, there was the Suez Crisis, and
56.
56.
Yeah.
But basically, heating up at that time, the Soviets basically influenced Egypt and also Syria. So how did the Cold War really affect the push for solution? And I can imagine that this may have actually been the cause that even in the 50s there was no solution possible. So
Right.
that's my first question. You didn't really elaborate on that, so I would be interested to hear how you look at this. And the second question, which is simply today, of these 750,000 people, now it's the first and second generation. How many people are we talking about? Maybe 2 million, 3 million people. Is there any estimate, or is there any reliable number of how many people would actually want to return to Israel, Palestine, and to their old homes? Has anybody asked these people?
Yeah, good. Two good questions. The first is, the Middle East was not treated or did not suffer from the Second World War as Europe did. And it was a different reality. And therefore, both the Americans and the Russians and the international organization did not treat the Middle East in the same way that they treated Europe. Which meant that actually, and it's very difficult to think about it now in 2019, when the Middle East is the area in the world where you say it's horrific, terrible things are happening, and so on. If you read the newspapers in Europe in 1948, they say, well, there's one place in the world where there is peace, there is calm, there is progress, there's a chance for change, there is a very interesting Communist Party, there is an interesting interaction between East and West. This was the Middle East. And therefore, the treatment of Zionism and the problem they created with Palestine was seen as something that destroys, in a way, a hope for a better Middle East. Of course, later on, other things happen. Now, as for the Cold War itself, it's very interesting that, I don't know if you know that, but the United States, whereas it did not in particularly like the emergence of progressive or radical, everybody should choose the term, Arab regimes and movement, although at first they were very supportive of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. It's very interesting, the Americans, I hinted this in my lecture, that the Americans were quite pro-Palestinians until Kennedy was assassinated. Maybe that's why Oliver Stone in the films thinks that the Israeli Mossad assassinated him. I don't think it's true, but it explains where it comes from. And therefore, you can say that the Cold War actually led the Western power, at least the United States, not the Western powers, to see the Palestinian problem as a humanitarian political problem that can easily be solved. And they didn't see the reasoning behind the Israeli position. It's very important to understand it. Later on, of course, the Cold War complicates things, because then you have not a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, you have a conflict between Israel and its neighboring Arab states. And Israel becomes the main base for the Americans, and the Arab world becomes kind of the Soviet Union basis. So I think that really didn't help, because then they start arming both sides, and they're becoming peons in the big chess board of the Cold War, which is never good for conflicts. The second question you were asking, the only census we have, the only real numbers we have are the United Nations numbers. And the United Nations numbers puts the Palestinian refugees of all generations at 5.5 million. 7? Yeah, the United Nations 5.7. The PLO says 7. The PLO says 7, the United Nations says 5.5. What would they like to happen? Every survey gets the results it wants. So when Israelis are behind the surveys, you will not be surprised that most of the refugees say that they don't want to return. And when the PLO is behind the survey, you will not be surprised that everybody wants to return. So I wouldn't put much on surveys. I think what is important is to know that the Palestinian individual and collective idea of what is to be a Palestinian is connected to the right of return. Does it mean that everyone would implement it or not? I don't know. But you know, as I know, if you go to the Jenin refugee camp, you go to the Yarmouk refugee camp, and you go to the Al-Hilwa refugee camp, and you meet a boy at the age of 5, and you ask him, where are you from? He would say Haifa or Jaffa or Baisan, namely for one of the 48 places. And I think that is part of the problem you will never be able to ignore. How practically you implement a return is a complicated issue. I have no doubt about it. As quite a few of the Palestinian homes that were taken in 48 are now populated by Palestinians, not just by Jews. It's a huge issue. But we have to start somewhere with a moral statement before we talk about practicalities. And practicalities can only be dealt in a comprehensive political solution. And as I said to you, I don't think I think the only solution is a democracy for everyone.
May I give
I cannot say
information? The Swiss made, a huge negotiation between non-governmental parties, and which lead up to the Geneva Convention. Yeah. And in this paper, they have really presented a lot of possible solutions, including how to deal with the right of return, how to to pay back goods and all that stuff. So I mean, there was a quite a reasonable possibility to go on this way, but it was refused.
Excuse me. Who talks? Thank you. As a Palestinian from Jaffa, and having lived there with my family in 48, we have to look back at the first square, which you touched at the end when the first Zionists came to Palestine. And I think it's the inherent idea of Zionism to have a state. Why do you want a state? Jewish people, the Arab Jews, I don't think they ever had the idea of having a state. And that meant to expel the Palestinians. And this is the thread that goes through history since 1917, if you want, till today. So the Palestinian Arab behavior is a reaction to what the Zionists did to us and to the whole region. And we talk about Israel. Israel is a sticker over Palestine. It is like a price tag in the sale. If you take it away, beneath it is still Palestine. It didn't disappear. And that's the core of dispute. And we can't solve problems for the future if we don't go to the beneath, down to the problem. And when Palestinians, like my parents were in Palestine, they saw Jews and said the Jews said, the Jews did, and then it was interpreted as being anti-Semitism. The Zionists, they didn't reveal their ideas at that time. They were just doing. And then the role of Great Britain, it has to be mentioned. Without letting all the immigration into Palestine, there would have never been this thing. I think there were 50,000 in 1917, and then there were 500,000 in 1948. And the Palestinian struggle never stopped. It started already at that time, and you know the history. I don't have to repeat it. And it is going on. Hamas is a part of it. Six-Day Wars is a part of it. Suez Crisis is a part of it. Jamal Abdel Nasser is a part of it. We have to look at things from our side, from the beginning till today, and then we can talk.
Well, I definitely agree, and I think that's what I was talking about. And I mentioned the fact that today in the academia around the world, the issue of Israel and Palestine is studied within comparison to other similar projects. And we even have a name for it. It's called settler colonialism, to distinguish it from classical colonialism. But Palestine is not the only country where European settlers came and said, this is our home, and the native people should get out. It's not the only place. In the United States, the European settlers genocided the native people, as they did in Australia, as they did in New Zealand. In South Africa, they've put the native people under an apartheid regime. Now, I agree, we go back, but we also have to think about the future. And you have 6 million Jews and 6 million Palestinians between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. You have another 5.5 million Palestinian refugees. Look at post-apartheid South Africa, where a settler community that imposed apartheid on the native people have eventually accepted the idea that in order for everyone to exist, you need to change the regime. You need a democratic system if you want to solve the issue, which didn't mean that the South African settlers will go back to their countries of origin. It meant that there is a different constitutional, democratic infrastructure on which the relationships are based. And I say, because of the history which you have described, including the British role in it, that's why we expect Britain to take a far more positive role than it does, but hopefully Jeremy Corbyn would be the next Prime Minister, and there will be a change in British policy, because he understands this responsibility. We need countries like Britain to help us to create that new reality, which does not deny the third generation of settlers the right to be there, but does not deny the fact that the indigenous population were expelled, dispossessed, discriminated against, and you have to create this system, as they are trying, and not always successfully in South Africa to do, to try and rebuild a society that corrects the injustices of the past and makes sure that they don't exist anymore. But as I said, I mean, you asked me, you know, about whether it's possible, not possible. At least let's talk about the real problem. You know, there's this Jewish saying that people tend to look for keys that they lost where there is light, but not where they lost the key. You know, we had a beautiful lamp, and we stood below this lamp because there was so much light, and we say this is where the solution is, but we lost the solution somewhere else where it was dark. So we need to put some light on this, and I think what you said, this narrative, is very important. Will be part of this search, hopefully, for reconciliation.
When you told us your story with the facts, I had two images in my head. One is 1948. It was not long that the Second War is gone. And the whole world, I mean, the UN was representing the world in a way, was also paralyzed about the horror of the Holocaust. And they feel a little bit guilty, I think, also. That's kind of psychology effect. That's why they accept this status. And I mean, it's time now to talk about all these things. And the other image was, I mean, that a lot of European Jewish people go to Palestine. And I had the other image was that a lot of people immigrate to America. And they had the same feeling and the same disaster with the natives in America. And sometimes I think it has something to do with the human being, you know, how they work, how they act in moments they think they have all the rights. Yeah. Yeah. And but I think it's very important. that we have sometimes is the time to go forward and take all the whole things in front and see what's going on.
I think it is important to remember, though, that when Britain promised Palestine to the Zionist movement, it was long before the Holocaust. And the person who promised, Lord Balfour, I don't know if many people know it, in 1906, he passed a law in the British Parliament that disallowed the Jews who were persecuted in Eastern Europe to enter England. So his support for the Jews going to Palestine was anti-Semitic, not because he believed that the Jews have the right to Palestine. He didn't want them in England.
He wanted to
get rid of them.
Yeah.
So I think it's important. But you're absolutely right about the Holocaust. I just want to say that this is, and you're right, I agree with you. It is part of the conversation. It is part of the conversation to say that when the international community at the time was represented by European countries, by the United States, by the Soviet Union. Most of the countries of the world were still not independent when the United Nations decided to create the State of Israel. It is important to say that this was a very easy way, among other things, not to deal with what Europe did to the Jews. It was very easy. And it was very clear that from the moment David Ben-Gurion, and there were a lot of Israelis who were angry about it, especially Menachem Begin. But the moment Ben-Gurion said, you know, we will be the first state that would say that there is a new Germany, he knew that the Western world would not interfere whatsoever with what Israel does in Palestine. This was the deal. Germany can only be quickly legitimized as a legitimate state after the Nazi period if Israel, as the representative of the Jewish victims, would legitimize it. In return, Israel demanded, apart from compensation and money and so on, it demanded a total silence on the side of Europe of what a lot of people knew was going on in Palestine. There were a lot of journalists in 1948. There were a lot of people from the Red Cross in Palestine. And they knew what I only learned 40 years later, that the Israeli army was expelling by force people, that they were killing people, that this was one war crime after the other in order to create the Jewish state. That's why Tom Seger calls his book A State at Any Price. The price was very high, and the Palestinians paid the price. And Europe said, this is a worthy price because we can forget about the Holocaust. I think that's very important. That's why we have to bring it back. We really have to bring it back. So I think I'm glad you mentioned it.
There's
another. Thank you. Just following on what you said right now, and coming back to the fact that, to your pessimistic view about the changing views of the Israeli population as of now. That is to say, the importance of the outside world to change things in Israel. Now, with regard to America, I think for the time being there's not much hope from there, but with regard to Europe, I would be interested in particular with regard to Germany about your personal experience. What you just said, the role, this bad conscience, not only of the Germans, I don't need to remind you of Vichy, Poland, I mean, anti-Semitism, France, Dreyfus, was, I mean, of course, the Germans were the worst, no question about it. But so this sense of responsibility made this happen, and the world turned a blind eye for many years on the things which happened in Israel. But now we are in 2018, and terrible things were happening in the last decades. Just think about Gaza, or to quote you, when you talk about an incremental genocide with regard to the people of Gaza. Now, against this background, I would be interested to hear from your personal experience when you have meetings, events like this in Germany. Did you have them at all, and could you maybe tell us a little bit about the difficulties the organizers have to invite you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think before I'll say something about what's happening today in Germany, I think it's important to understand, of course, that there was already in world public opinion, not just in Germany, a certain significant shift with regard to Palestine that all the time has kind of setbacks. You think that something is beginning to change, and then you have 9/11, 2001, and then all the success of beginning to change the American public opinion is being retracted for a while at least because of 9/11. And then come the awful events in Syria, Iraq, and the rest of the Arab world, and people say to you, how can you compare? And then again, there is a sense of a distraction that they don't deal with it. So this also has to be taken into account, not to mention the fact that, of course, the Palestinian, as was mentioned by our Palestinian friend from Jaffa, the Palestinians resisted the colonization of Palestine from the very beginning, and an anti-colonialist resistance, not only in Palestine, anywhere in the world, is not done by flowers and chocolate. It's sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's armed, and that, of course, allows people to forget about the history and to begin with the violence of the oppressed by saying, you see, they are violence, and therefore Israel has to do what it does, because unfortunately it deals with violent people. All these things have to be taken into account because Germany is exceptional, but also not exceptional. So everything that works on other communities also works on Germany. But of course, you're right, Germany is an exceptional case. I see a very dramatic shift in Germany, I must say, from my own personal experience. I'm touring Germany every now and then, and until recently, it was very easy to cancel my meetings for anybody who wanted to do it. People would immediately say, sorry, there's resistance to your appearance, and people would say, okay, I'm sorry, I cannot invite you. In the last two, 3 times, people were not caving in, and they did not. One good example is the University of Tübingen, that 10 years ago, anybody who tried to invite me to this important university was unsuccessful. And this time, again, people said, no, you cannot invite him for whatever reason. And yet the university decided not to give in to the pressure, which is very encouraging. The same happened in the universities of Stuttgart. In many places, I'm now talking in Germany in places where I was forbidden. And that's a very good sign. I'm also writing a book with a German colleague on the Palestine in the German discourse. And we find out very interesting things. For instance, among German politicians and diplomats, sometimes, there is far more shift than we know than among the academics. You would have expected a little bit different picture. But the worst group in Germany in this respect are the academics. Even worse than a journalist. And the best group, to our surprise, were the diplomats, who know too much. They don't do much, the diplomats, of course, but they do, but they know. They don't deny also that they know. And also the people who deal with NGOs, who deals with funding. Again, they don't do much, but they know. We were first interested to know how much people know before we ask ourselves how much people do. So I'm optimistic about Germany. I think things will change with the younger generation, but it will take time. And of course, you have phenomena like anti-Deutsch with all its complications. But I think that Israel has a problem. All these places where it feels still very comfortable, like Switzerland, Germany, France, maybe parts of Italy. It doesn't feel very comfortable in Norway, England, Spain, and Portugal. But all these places where it still feels it kind of has a moral shield are going to change, are going to change. And they are changing, because the younger, you cannot throw at the younger generation the Holocaust. You cannot throw at the younger generation anti-Semitism. Not at the age of internet and visits. They know what's happening. And you can't tell them, but you know, if you are against the arrest without trial, if you are against demolition of houses, if you are against shooting demonstrators, if you are against checkpoints and humiliation, then you are anti-Semitic. I'm sorry, a normal young person would not buy this kind of accusation. An older generation, maybe yes, because they don't want to think. They don't want to be guilty of something they were already guilty of. So I think this is something the Israelis would have to take into account. This is not necessarily good news, because there is, as we know and mentioned here before, the reaction in Israel is to become more right-wing, more entrenched when this criticism intensifies. But I must tell you, studying, I wrote a book comparing South Africa to Israel, called The Many Faces of Apartheid, Israel and South Africa. It was, by the way, the same in South Africa. The more the international community said, I'm sorry, we know too much of what you are doing in South Africa, the more right-wing the South African government became. But then it was easier for the international community to say, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. Israel is going very quickly in that direction, very quickly in that direction. Yes, they are lucky. You have the Trumps of the world that give you the wrong impression, I think, that Israel has strong allies and therefore it doesn't matter what Jews for Peace in America want or J Street in America want. I don't think Trump is the future. I think he's an aberration. I think you need him in order to do something else. So if anybody in Israel sort of relies on Trump as being the main guarantor of Israel's safety, I think it's a very dangerous assumption. But again, I'm talking about the future. We don't know. Germany is changing, not quickly enough, not the political elite, but it's changing. The problem for every one of us is that when we go back to Palestine, and we talk to Palestinians in high schools, they say to me, very nice your report of how Samir succeeded in letting you talk in KOSMOS despite everyone else in Zurich. And they say, this is very impressive, we're very happy, but what is the impact on our life? There's nothing. If anything, it gets worse. We have to think, how come that this dramatic shift in world public opinion on Palestine has no impact whatsoever on the reality on the ground? What are we missing? That a democratic wish of so many people around the world for the governments to take a tough position on the suffering of the Palestinian is not translated into the reality on the ground. This is something we have. I don't have a good answer for you, by the way. I'm not claiming to have an answer. I'm just saying we should talk about it more.
Ilan, I am very much impressed about your speech intellectually and emotionally.
Thank you.
I'm a member of the Jewish community, and you know, in the whole diaspora we have about 8 million Jewish people. And I want to ask if you have ideas, if to win more normal Jews, not like me, to go in this direction. This is my question.
Very good question. And I think what was so interesting in watching Jewish liberal Zionist communities and how they reacted to the reality in the last 10 years is to find out that there is a limit for what psychologists called cognitive dissonance. When what you believe and what you see have nothing in common. And I always thought that liberal Jews, liberal Zionist Jews, both inside Israel, which they disappeared, I mean, they don't exist anymore, but they still exist abroad, that liberal Zionists were the best people in the world in pushing a cognitive dissonance to an unbelievable extreme. They were able to say to themselves, yes, it's not democratic, yes, it's oppression, yes, it's a war criminal, but it will all disappear once there will be reasonable Palestinians, once there will be a Palestinian Mandela, once the Palestinians would understand that it's better for them. They found all kinds of explanation why they should support something that basically they didn't want to support, to their credit, because the same Jews would have demonstrated against apartheid South Africa, and they demonstrated against the discrimination of African Americans in the civil rights movement in the United States, and they demonstrated against Pinochet, and they demonstrated against the American imperialism in Vietnam. But when it came to Israel, they said, no, it's not the same. And they kept building this theory that the two-state solution helped them very much in that direction, saying it will all disappear once there is peace, so we have to be tolerant. And I asked myself, when would they say, no, now it's too much? When will they stop? And I once spoke to such a community in St. John's Wood in London, and I said to them, what is your red line? I said, what do you mean? I said, well, let's say tomorrow Israel passes a law that allows the police to expel 3 Palestinian villages and execute any Palestinian they want. Is this a red line? They said yes. I said, okay. What will happen if Israel passes a law which would be really like an apartheid law? They said, no, then we don't support Israel. I said, well, they have just passed such a law, do you know? And then suddenly you see, they said, no, we don't know enough about this law. I said, don't worry, I'm here. I came all the way to explain to you about this law. And I'm asking myself, when would be this happening? And I think that if you look at the place to look at is the American Jewish community and the younger generation there. The younger American generation Jewish community is not buying into it anymore. Even the Discovery Plan, Taglit, this program, Israel has a program, it brings young American Jews to Israel. They hope that they fall in love in Israel and will immigrate to Israel. And then they found out that quite a few of these young American Jews, they come to Israel, they see the occupation and become BDS activists. So now the Israelis are trying to take them from Ben Gurion Airport to meet some gay people in Tel Aviv, to see a Luna Park in Haifa, to see the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and quickly back to the airport. God forbid they will see anything that will turn them into BDS activists. And it just shows you they can't do it anymore. They can't do it anymore. I think that this, what you said, Yochi, is one of the key factors that would make my dream, at least, even more possible. I think it will start with the Jewish communities in the United States. And I think already now, if you talk to Israeli diplomats, they would tell you that the most important support for Israel does not come anymore from the Jewish community, but unfortunately still comes from the Christian Zionist community, who wants the Jews to return to the Holy Land so that Jesus can come back, and then the Jews will have to convert to Christianity or be shish kebabbed in hell. It's a double bill. You get rid of the Jews and you get Jesus. I mean, who can ask for more as a Christian? So unfortunately, this simplistic but typically American kind of McDonald's religious meal is working for too many Americans. So we have a problem with them, much more than I think than with the Jewish community, you know. But I think, yes, I think it's a ray of hope that what you and I think, believe is a Jewish heritage cannot allow a decent Jewish person to stand by with what's happening and not support the Palestinians. As Jews, for us, I think the cause of the Palestinian is a human cause, a moral cause, but also a Jewish cause. And I think many more Jews in the world understand it than ever before.
Good. Yes, there is one.
Someone there on the left.
Yeah, but huh?
Okay.
Okay. I don't see very well. Can you make a little bit more? No? Why not? Yeah?
So it's me. Here. I have a short question. We talked a lot about inside Israel and Europe and the US, but what about the neighboring countries? I'm really bad at this. I don't even know which ones are there exactly. There's Jordan and there's Lebanon and... So how about these countries? Which of them matter? And you said something about democracy and this is needed. Is this good or bad in the others around, and does that matter as well?
Yeah, well, of course it matters. I think that a real democracy for Israelis and Palestinians would have a huge influence on the Arab world. And on the other hand, the continued colonization of Palestine, the continued oppression of the Palestinians, gives a lot of a lot of people in the Arab world, whether regime or opposition, justification to continue with their own violations of human rights and civil rights. It's very clear that the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole needs a proper conversation of human rights and civil rights. That's clear. And they need the help of the international community to make this conversation effective. But you cannot have an effective conversation on human rights and civil rights with exceptionalism. By saying one part of the Middle East, we don't talk about human rights and civil rights. In the rest, we do. You need to talk about everything. And the violation of the Palestinian human rights and civil rights is much longer than the violation of some of the Arab communities. Not maybe as bad as it is now, but much longer, and has an accumulative effect. So yes, I think that a genuine reconciliation and a just solution for Palestine, in fact, the liberation of Palestine, a proper project of liberation that would liberate not only the Palestinians, but also the Jews from their colonialist role, would have an immense impact on the rest of the Arab world. I'm fully convinced about it, that it's not the only thing that is wrong there. It's not the only thing that would change the situation, but definitely the one thing we should fight against is the Israeli notion that Palestine and Israel, or whatever you want to call it, is not part of the Middle East. This is what Israel claims. It claims, in the words of the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, that Israel is a villa in the jungle. This is the concept. The Middle East is not a jungle. Israel is not a villa. And this kind of discourse betrays the main problem. If you have already settled by force in the midst of the Middle East, you are part of it. And you're part of its problems and you're part of its solution. You cannot think that you are something that is alien to the area and be surprised that the area alienates you.
André, is zo lang daar altijd. Sorry.
It was mentioned that without the Holocaust and all this Nazi criminality, the international community would not have accepted what happened in 1948, right?
Right.
And so I conclude from this that Germany has a responsibility for the Palestinians, because finally they caused, secondarily, the problem. But I don't see any responsibility taken from Germany. Do you agree with this? They always support, Merkel says we are fully behind the Israeli politics and so forth.
Yes, I think that you're right. The Germans have responsibility as well as the British have, as well as the Americans have, as the rest of the international community. Each one has a different responsibility. You identified correctly the German responsibility and you would, as I said, for two reasons you would expect a country like Germany taking a different position now in 2018 on Palestine. One is because of that historical responsibility, but secondly, I think more and more people would like their governments, even in Germany, to take a different role from the one that they are taking. I think we need a European spring when it comes to Palestine, not just an Arab spring.
May I have a other question, which is, you mentioned at the beginning the Jewish people. Is there a Jewish people? I have some problems with this. If there would be, since this is a religion, there should be a Muslim people, a Catholic people, and so forth, a Buddhistic people.
I have a different take on this. I don't have a people barometer, kind of. I put people and then I see if there are people. I think what is important, people are a group of people, is entitled to define themselves as they wish. I have no problem with that. And they can even tell themselves any story that they want. The Greeks today can claim to be descendants of the ancient Greeks, which they are not. The Italians can claim to be descendants of the Romans, which they are not. I don't know what you people tell yourself here in Switzerland, which is probably another myth. I don't care about this. People can tell themselves whatever they want. The question is, what do you do in the name of the story? If in the name of the story you kill, you expel, you colonize, then I have a problem with the story. I don't care whether you are rightly defining yourself as a nation or not. I care what you do in that, under the moral definition that you have chosen for yourself. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. My name is Majid. I'm a Palestinian from Gaza. I'm very glad about your optimism, by the way, and I personally have been on a tour with the Student for Justice in Palestine, in the USA. And I worked for Jewish Forces for Peace, whether when I was in Gaza and whether when I was in the US. And I'm very impressed, seriously, about how when I visited them in 2012, they had about 15 employees. And when I look now and I'm in contact with them, they have over 40, 45 employees. And that tells a lot about even our, the students' movements and universities. When some friends who have started Student for Justice in Palestine, which has over 150 chapters around 150 universities around the world, led by Jewish people, Jewish students, as you mentioned. First was forbidden to in Berkeley University when they started in 2004, and now we are many. We are 150 voices. I tell you the truth, before I met them all, I was very much a bit pessimistic, and I tried to keep my hope in Gaza. And I was going to return to Gaza at that time, and I returned, and I had a lot of hope. And I asked myself a question, is the fact that how those overcome, because how they overcome to be the people who they are, at the moment, and is the fact that they really didn't return to Israel, since very young age, have brought them to the way they are. Because I live in Berlin, I work with BDS in Europe, but mainly in Berlin, and I see many Jewish. Some of them are liberal Zionists, but many escaped apartheid Israel, and they come to Berlin. We work together in many senses. I have even some criminal courts on BDS and anti-Semitism with some Jewish friends, and to see this, to see them as the many Jewish, there are over, I think, 55,000 or 60,000, but they are not able to break. The very few are working with us in Berlin to break the German discourse and the Holocaust industry, use of Holocaust in Germany, which is very big pressure on us. I'm very glad about your optimism, by the way, regarding Germany. That is something. I really want some more deeper, just my last things, my last question. I hope you got my first question. I did. Okay, super. The second question is, I really would like more deeper aspect to neutrality and compensation. Because as a Palestinian, you talk about acknowledgement and narratives, and I worked with it in different spaces, because what I lacked, and I felt even we as Palestinians lack, is acknowledgement. And this acknowledgement, it gives us a lot of pain, because we don't wait acknowledgements from Israelis, we want from people here, in the group. And we have lots of difficulty fighting for acknowledgements from all these people around the world, from Europeans, because we feel that they are our alliance and we need to work with them. I don't know how can we tell them to not be neutral, or how we cannot compensate. It's really hard. We are in a time in our generation to not compensate. Thank you, and more in BDS. Thank you.
Thank you. For your first question, I think that you're right. I think people who are, let's say, Israeli Jews who get out of Israel, it's an important chapter in the way they change their mind. And being outside, it's very difficult to develop critical views from the inside. But we want some of them to go back. If all the good Israelis would leave, then we will have not enough people for the struggle. And I remember this was the problem for Jews in South Africa. The white regime in South Africa encouraged Jews who were pro-ANC to leave. They said, why don't you leave? We won't arrest you. We are not Africans, so we won't arrest. But we want you outside. We want you to leave. But if you stay, you will be treated like the African members of the ANC. And I think that this kind of solidarity we need to build now for the future, because for too long, because of the reality, it made sense. We didn't build a joint liberation movement of both communities. We need a joint liberation movement now. Yeah, Matzpen was a good model. You're right. I hope that depends also on the PLO, not just on the Jews. I think there is. I think there is a chance of building that kind of solidarity. Let me quickly answer your second question, which I totally forgot, which was
I have really to tell you that we should come to an end, because I see that a lot of people start to
Oh yeah, just say about acknowledgement. Just one sentence about acknowledgement. Okay. Just one sentence. You're absolutely right. One of the main problems is the discourse of parity. When people say, we want you to balance. If you bring Ilan Pappé, you have to balance this with someone else, as if the outside is balanced. It's a struggle. And one of the groups that should help you with this, and us, all of us, is the academia, who doesn't do its role yet. You cannot leave everything for activism. If you start teaching the reality in Palestine as an imbalanced reality, as part of your academic work, then it will affect also the public discourse, the media and so on. I think for too much we assumed that it's only the activists. That's why I founded in Exeter, where I teach, the Center of Palestine Studies, because I believe we need also to study properly, academically, in a way that does not accept the idea of neutrality. But that academic, a committed academic, is a good academic, not a bad academic. That's what we should strive for. Thank you.
So we are coming to an end, yes. Maybe one or two last questions before all of us disappear.
Yeah. I mentioned before, but I'll take that question and yeah.
Okay, I have a question for you, Shamir. You remember a couple of weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, there was also a seminar or a lecture here on the legitimism of criticizing Israel. And my question to you is, there was a very, very tense, sort of aggressive atmosphere. Tonight is completely different, sort of very calm. I don't know if it's Ilan's influence. He's a very calm and charming, extremely charming person. I don't know if that's an influence. This is my question for you. And my question for you, Ilan, has Israel ever excused officially towards the Palestinians for the Nakba? Has there been an official excuse? Probably not. And if, like in Canada, I think Canada and Australia, and what would that impact, do you think the Israeli state should excuse itself on, and what would be the impact of such a statement?
You want to answer the question? You had the question.
No, he gave the answer. You know,
okay.
it's you. You know,
just
because of you.
I wanted to hear it again.
I will bring you now every month. You know.
I wanted, no. Let me just say one word on BDS and then continue. I already mentioned I support the BDS fully, and as I said, because I don't think there's a chance for a change from within Israel, we need to send a strong message of pressure to Israel. But as I said, BDS is, we have the B and the D, we don't have the S. We have the boycott, divestment, and in the case of South Africa, we know without sanctions, boycott and divestment is not enough, but it's an amazing movement that is growing, and I think history would judge it as an important part of the success, if the struggle succeeds.
If we have the BDS as a theme, that was also at that evening also, you know, they always mentioned that boycotting Israel is like, you know, boycotting the Jews in the 30s.
Yeah. You know, people, the one thing you should never do when you know that an historical context or any context that is given to a just action that you take, if people put a context which is ridiculous, that has nothing to do with what you are doing, the worst thing you can do is to enter the conversation on the premise of that idea, that you start saying, no, let me explain to you why the boycott of Israeli goods is not like the boycott of Jewish goods in Nazi Germany. You could, I never do this. I say, I'm sorry. Do you want to talk to me in the 21st century why I, as a person with a modicum of morality, would always boycott anyone who oppresses, anyone who colonizes, anyone who discriminates. This has nothing to do with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And I quote someone, but maybe it's not a good thing to quote in Zurich, or someone, we need something a bit more progressive. I quote Ahmad Yassin, the founder of Hamas, who said, if Muslims would have done to us what the Jews are doing to us in Gaza, I would do the same thing. I would fight in the same means against the Muslim oppressors. This is about oppression. This is not about who the oppressors are, but what the oppressors are doing. If the oppressors are Jewish, Buddhists, Muslims, and atheists, it doesn't matter. What matters is what they're doing and not who they are. And I think that's the main difference. By the way, I hope an intelligent person would understand that you boycott here something that someone has done, not you do boycott someone because of who he or she are. So I think that's very, very important to explain to people. The question of the apology, I don't wait for the Israeli apology because I learned that the only settler colonial projects that have a sorry day are those who almost totally obliterated the native people. They can allow themselves to say sorry because they've already killed almost everyone. I don't wait for the Israeli acknowledgement of apology. I want the Israelis to show accountability, responsibility. And I think if we really want to solve this issue, it is the best acknowledgement of what happened in 1948 is to remove all the colonialist and apartheid features of the State of Israel, beginning with not allowing Palestinian refugees to return and ending with the robbery of land, water, and resources of the Palestinians wherever they are. And in between, there are all kinds of colonialist and apartheid practices, from destroying villages, demolishing houses, humiliating people. I think this is the best proof that someone in Israel is sorry for what had been done to the Palestinians. I don't need an apology. I don't think the Palestinians need an apology. What they need is an end to injustice. That's what they need. Thank you.
So we are good in time. It means that maybe I change now to German. So your books can be found there. Most of them are in English, unfortunately, but as I saw, the people understand very well English. Draussen haben wir auch noch eine Ausstellung vom Café Palestine, für die die Ausstellung schauen. Und natürlich haben wir auch noch eine Bar zum Trinken. Und etwas ganz Wichtiges, das mal, wir haben ja den Abend immer gratis, aber das mal, weil wir ihn von weit her geholt haben und untergebracht und uns um uns kümmern, würden wir gerne Kollekte da machen, damit wir einen Teil von unserem Aufwand auch können, da wieder zurückbekommen, damit wir in der nächsten Zeit wieder andere Kosmopolitics dann können machen.
Ich muss noch etwas anhängen.
Ja.
Zürich Mahnwach tut sich ja auch für die ganze Sache.
Zürich Mahnwach setzt sich auch ein. Und das ist Berner Mahnwach. Und du tust. Okay.
Wo man können, nein, ich will sie nicht wieder nach Bern heimnehmen, weil sie gehen ganz im Sinn von Ilan.
Okay. Also, jeder muss so ein Blatt nehmen. Okay, gut. Gut, merci vielmals und bis zum nächsten Mal. Und ja, wir wären froh, wenn wir uns unterstützen könnten.